So, adding a role. And the first role that we're going to be adding to our server is, like I said, making the server into a domain controller. Creating a domain. Now, creating a domain is one of those fundamental tasks that all server admins need to know how to do, or even network admins. It's a thing that starts your network. When you're building a new network from scratch, you have to have a domain controller in your corporate environment to make your life just easier in the long run. So, to be able to create a domain controller, we have to install a certain role with server. So how do we install a role? If we are on Server Manager and we go to the dashboard, it gives us nice and big add roles and features. If we were maybe on local server, we can still add it by going to the Manage button up here on the top right, and then there we can also add roles and features. Whichever way you do it, it will take you to the same screen, the Add Roles and Feature wizard. This is a screen that as a network admin you'll become extremely familiar with. You will use this to add anything to a server. So we start off by clicking on Next, deciding what type of installation are we going to do. Are we going to add a role or a feature on a single server? Or are we going to do a remote desktop installation? So am I going to be installing a role on another server? That's one that I've added. Of course, we are going to be doing it on this server. Hey, so we'll make sure we've selected role-based or feature-based. We then click on Next. It will then ask us, on what server do you want to install this role? Now, I only have one server in my network, so there's only one server here, my server 2012 R2DC, with that specific IP address and that operating system that it's running. So we'll select that one and say Next. Now we have all of the roles that you can add. As you can see, there's not a lot, but there's stuff like Active Directory Domain Service, Federation Service, Right Management, Application, DHCP, DNS, Fax Server, Hyper-V, if you want to turn the server into a virtual machine, Print and Document, Remote Access, Remote Desktop, Web Server, all these little things that we've been talking about over the last couple of months, all these roles that you can have. Here you can see all of them in a nice list. Now, because we are going to be creating a domain, we need to install the Active Directory Domain Service, or ADDS. This is the role that will turn this computer into a domain so that we can start creating a domain and add networks and computers to our domain. So all we have to do is click on the little tick box. A little window will pop up to say that you also need to add all of these extra little things as well for ADDS to work. So you just say, yep, I want to add all of these features as well, please. We then click on Next. This is a list of all the features that you can also install. Things like Telnet, or SMTP, or SMB bandwidth limiting, biometric framework for fingerprint scanners, and things like that. So in Windows, you can install roles, and you can also install features. The difference between the two is that a role provides something to the network, whereas a feature provides something to a role. Okay, so a feature doesn't provide something to the entire network. It provides something for that single computer, whereas a role adds something to the entire network. We're not going to be adding any features, so we're just going to skip this step and click on Next. Okay, now it's going to tell us, okay, cool, you want to install ADDS? Yep. Things to note, stuff like you need to have an active or an IP address, you need to have a DNS server, basic little things that you need to be aware of when installing an Active Directory Domain Service. I'm happy with all of that stuff, so we'll just say Next. Then it will tell us, cool, these are the things that we're going to be installing. And I've got a little tick box right up here that says that if the installation requires you to restart the server, please do it automatically. Okay, don't ask me to do the restart. Just do the restart as part of the installation. It's all good. Okay, so once we've selected everything, we'll just say install. And what will happen now is we'll now actually start the installation of the ADDS role. This might take a minute, it might take 10 minutes, it might take half an hour. Of course, that just all depends on your computer that you have, how fast it is, and all of those things. This shouldn't take too long right now, because like I said, we did give this a lot of memory, and we are running on very fast storage. And the processor we have in here is also not too bad. So this shouldn't take too long. The nice thing about these roles is that I can close this and it will continue installing in the background. So I can now do other stuff. I can open up folders, whatever I want. The installation will continue in the background. So you might be asking yourself, well, how do you know the installation is done? Some of you might have noticed this. By this little flag, this little warning popped up. So if I click on that little warning, it tells me that configuration is required for Active Directory domain services. So it's telling that, cool, the installation is completed. You can see at the bottom, installation succeeded. Now that we've installed ADDS, now we need to create the domain. And that's what we mean by the second one. Post-deployment configuration is required, and specifically, I need to create a domain controller. So all I have to do is just say, yeah, I want to create a domain controller, please, by clicking on Promote the Server to a domain controller. And then what we'll have is we'll have the domain controller wizard will pop up. Okay, so this is now installed the role. Now we're configuring the role. So we've got a couple of options. We are creating a domain. So are we adding a domain controller to an existing domain, which means I already have a domain at work. My boss asked me to add another domain controller because we needed one for whatever reason. Or are we adding a new domain to an existing forest? So I've got a forest called ITCA. I have a domain in Joburg already and a domain in Cape Town. But now we've opened up a new branch in Durban, so we need to add another domain in Durban. Okay. Or are we doing everything from scratch? Are we adding a new forest and a new domain? You know, is this the first time we're doing it? Of course, this is the first time we're doing it at the moment, so we'll make sure that we've add a new forest is selected. Then we need to give our forest a name, our network a name. And the name always have to have a name dot something. Okay, so Android.test or Android.local, or what you guys might have seen at the college, ITCA.local. Hey, you need to give your network a name, and it has to have a full stop in the middle of the names. The first part is normally the name of the network, full stop, and then after the full stop is normally what type of domain is it. Is it a local domain for only local computers? Is it an external domain for public computers? Is it a test domain for because we're just doing testing? You can put any word in there. If I want, I can put test QW, QWERTY. It doesn't matter. As long as I have a dot something or something dot something. Okay, so let's go back to Android.test because that's what I want to call it. We'll say next. It will now basically create this domain that we've asked it to create. This normally does take a second or two. It's doing a lot of work in the background here at the moment. Okay, so this does take a while. It normally doesn't take this long though. So let's pause the video. Okay, we don't have to. There we go. It's finished up. Okay, the next little section is what functional level of this forest or domain are we running? This is basically where we choose what is the lowest version of server that I'm going to be running in this network. Okay, in our case, we only have the one server, so we're going to select server 2012 R2. But if I had another server running 2008, I would have selected it here to say, I'm also running server 2008 in this network. Please make sure that you're not using anything too fancy or anything too specific. Okay. So we're going to leave it on 2012 R2. Then it's going to ask us, what do you want this domain controller to be? Do you want it to be a domain name server or a DNS server as well? Okay, we can say no for now because we're going to add the DNS role a bit later. It has to be something called a global catalog server. Global catalog server is what we use for searching the domain database. And if I have a domain controller already in this domain, I can make this computer a read-only domain controller or an RODC. This means that I won't be able to make any changes on the server, add new users or anything like that. It will just be stuck as a read-only computer. And then the last thing that we need to do on here is to give a password for the recovery of the domain. Windows will automatically back up the database and keep it safe. If I need to recover that database, if I need to make changes, I have to enter in this DSRM password, as they call it. It can be the same password that you use for logging into Windows. It doesn't have to be different. Okay, so we'll say next. If then it will ask us to add NetBIOS stuff. We don't really have any NetBIOS computers in this network, so we are just going to skip the step when it comes up. The rest of this, actually, you can just next the whole way through. You don't really have to set up all of these things. Okay. This asks you where you want to save the database, where do you want to save the log files, and where do you want to save the sysvol folder in your domain. You can leave it as default, which I suggest, or you can change this location to save these things in another location that's not default. I'm going to leave it default. You normally should leave it default. Okay. Then it asks us to review. Okay. All the settings that we've chosen. If we're happy with everything, we say next. And this server is now going to do a prerequisite check. So it's going to check to make sure I've got all the stuff needed to actually now create a domain controller and to create a domain. This does take a little bit of time, and most likely we will actually come back with an error or two. Hopefully those errors won't actually stop or prevent the system from continuing. I can tell you right now that one of the errors will be that I don't have a DNS server, which of course we don't have a DNS server. Hey, yeah, okay, so otherwise it says no, we're all good. All prerequisites checks have passed successfully. We can click on install to begin the installation. We did have a warning though, something to do with cryptography. So maybe our encryption is going to be a little bit not so good, but that's something that we can fix at a later stage if we need to. At the moment, we don't need to. So as everything else is happy, we're just going to say install. And this will now start the installation and the configuration of creating a domain, making this computer a domain controller. It will create the database, create log files, install the features and the roles that are required. It most likely will restart as well at some point in time. And then once it's restarted and we've logged back in, everything will be all good. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here so that the people watching this doesn't have to sit through this whole process. Okay, so once you've installed everything, you can now see that the server was successfully configured and it automatically restarted. And it's now going to ask us to sign in as soon as the restart is done, which it seems to be. So I just want to show you guys this Control-Alt-Delete button while we're here. So we click on that little button, remember, Control-Alt and Delete, and it will automatically pop that into the screen. Okay, looks like it's still restarting. Did it freeze up? Don't tell me it froze up. It was actually still shutting down. I was a little bit too eager. Okay. I'm used to doing this on very fast servers where this takes minutes. Actually, this even didn't take that long. This host that I'm running here is actually not too bad. Okay, so again, I'm just going to pause the video so that the poor guys watching this doesn't have to sit through all of this wait time. Okay, so we've now waited the required amount of time for this now to install the settings and restart. So now it's going to ask us to actually install or to log in. And you guys might see here something looks a little bit different. Hey, I now have the term Andre in front of my user account, in this case administrator. This happens as soon as you're in a domain, the domain name, ITCA, Andre, IBM, whatever, will pop up before the username because we're now running as a domain administrator. So I'll log back in again, and it should then continue with the setting up of everything. Okay. And what we will see now all of a sudden is if we keep a close eye here on the left, we now have something called ADDS that's been added on here. Okay, this is now telling you that yes, this computer is now a domain controller, and you can now configure, manage, and do everything that you need to for a domain. Okay, so very simple. Now is where the hard parts begin, is now setting up the domain, setting up the users, things like that. That's little stuff that we'll cover on in the other books that's still to come, is how to create user accounts and group accounts and setting permissions and security and things like that in an actual domain environment. Okay. What I now want to do for the next little connection, of course, is how to set up and install a DNS. But that will be for the next video. Okay.